Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and thank you for joining my live stream today. Today, I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence regulation. And this is a bit of a sketchy area for me because I am not a regulator, I am not a policy expert, but I wanted to dig down deeper into what's happening in the world of regulations because I think it's important for us as leaders, as business people, as nonprofit organization leaders in government to understand what is going on with regulation on a global basis, and in particular, how that is going to impact our work in the artificial intelligence and specifically in the development of generative AI. So let's get into this. So why pay attention to regulation? Well, first of all, it's a good thing because it's trying to put into statutes and regulations a norm, a standard, guidelines of what good behavior looks like. And especially in the areas of what will you be accountable for? What will you be transparent about? And what does fairness look like in the world of artificial intelligence? And the reason for this is that the technology is a neutral player. It will just be developed. And especially since there's so much to gain from a business perspective, from a security perspective, we have people going and developing a lot of these technologies without a lot of guardrails. And so we want to be able to balance the ability for organizations, technology companies, even governments to be able to leverage all of these artificial intelligence technologies, but also balance that against the need for people to have, again, trust and transparency to make sure that the rights of citizens, of consumers, of businesses, and even the protection of governments are ensured. So that's why regulations are important. In the end, it's a balancing of all of these competing interests to make sure that the common good is actually elevated. So I encourage you to, first of all, welcome yourself, say where you're coming from, and also how you are thinking about regulation. What kind of approach are you taking as an organization? How are you following it even? What questions or concerns you may have, and I'll do my best to try to address them. If not here, then afterwards in the comments too as well. Because we're all learning here, as I like to say, this is all new. And I can tell you, staying on top of all of these things is extremely difficult. So let me just get into it. First of all, I just want to say hi to Teresa. Thank you for joining. If coming from a New Jersey pharma company in R&D and change management, Teresa, you know a lot about what it means to be a disruptive leader then. So welcome to the live stream and looking forward to continuing the conversation with you. So I'm going to divide up the way to think about the regulatory landscape into three sections. You've got China, the European Union, and the United States. And I'm going to go first with China because it's the area that I know the least about. I'm just beginning to understand how they're thinking about regulatory actions when it comes to AI. So one of the things that they have been pretty active in, and there's a group called the Cybersecurity Administration of China, short for CAC. And one of the things they've been really focused on is consumer notifications and consumer rights. So the idea here is that they want to make sure that any sort of online recommendations that consumers may be getting, any sort of notifications that they maybe have, that any recommendations are moral, they're ethical, they're accountable, transparent. And I love this phrase, disseminates positive energy. So it is additive to people's experiences. And in particular, they're requiring that people be notified when artificial intelligence is being used to determine what information is displayed to them, and also for them to be able to opt out of being targeted. And also in particular, it just makes inappropriate, it regulates the fact that you cannot offer and use artificial intelligence to offer different prices to different consumers. So in terms of fairness, and the idea is that if you know more information about a customer, can you offer them a different price than other consumers? And this is not seen as fair. Again, one of the three tenets of accountability, transparency, and fairness. China is very focused on that transparency and fairness of artificial intelligence in the use of its systems. So right now, the regulation is really covering primarily companies that are using artificial intelligence within the territory of China, but we expect that they will be looking and expanding that to any entity that's outside of China and offers products and services, online applications and platforms to people in China. So that's a very quick overview of China. The way that some people who follow the space have characterized it is that they are very, very focused on the consumer and the citizen experience, but they also have an underlying motive to make sure that the China entity, the state of China, is protected. And again, it's primarily through the lens of protecting its citizens. So I want to go on and talk a little bit about, also the one thing that they are very keen on is IP and intellectual property infringement. And so one of the key things they want to ensure is that the content used to train generative AI is that they actually have the rights and that using legitimate data to train the algorithms. So this is going to come up again and again in some of the other areas, but it was interesting that they have explicitly been talking about this in their regulatory instances. And other places like the EU and US are kind of dabbling in that area, but it isn't as central as it is in China. So that's a quick view of China. I want to spend a lot of time on what the European Union is doing. They currently, I just want to see if there's any other comments. Okay, we're good for now. Sorry to be so geeky about this, but I find this absolutely fascinating because you've got these three major powers in the artificial intelligence space, and they're all approaching the regulation in different ways. And that's going to cause a lot of problems, I believe. And you'll see in just a second what's happened with the EU. And because if one region takes a really strong and very clear stance about what is required to operate in that region, then the other regions have to norm themselves to those regulations. Because if you're a global company, you're going to have to abide by what's happening in the EU, what's happening in China, what's happening in the US. And those three standards are not necessarily converging in the same area. So this is going to get a lot more confusing than clear over the next few years. All right, so I want to go and show what's happening in the EU. And so there's something that's been called the EU AI Act. And here's a quick summary. Let me just pop this up so you can see a little bit better. And the idea here is that they have different tiers of acceptable risk. And so at the most bottom level, they have minimal risk. And this is when AI is being used to, for example, catch spam in your emails. It's being used in video games to create a better experience. So there's not a lot of risk there, totally allowed. One level higher risk, they call it limited risk, are things where you're using chatbots or there's a potential for deep fake videos. And here there's it's allowed, but there are going to be some regulations subject to that show about transparency. Again, the idea being what's driving that chatbot? What are the sources being used? What are the sources being used for creating these videos? Is it legitimate? Is it not? Do we use watermarks? All these kinds of questions. But what's underlying that generative AI? And then a higher risk, and these are going to require mandatory requirements. And they're things like autonomous vehicles, medical devices, when you're scoring exams or using scoring to review resumes. These are places where artificial intelligence could have a positive or adverse outcome. Positive or adverse impact on the outcome. And there needs to be clarity on how artificial intelligence is being used. The algorithm, is it being fair? Is it being, are you creating accountability? You can understand how the inputs, understand how things are working, how decisions are being made. Because you can imagine, for example, if you're using these technologies to score applicants to a job, how do you know that's not being discriminatory? That it is being fair and weighing all the different aspects. And if you need to have that transparency to be able to check the algorithm and understand that it is being accountable to these checks, you can be transparent about how it's being fair or not fair. So a lot of that focus is really on, again, this really key area. And you can imagine for autonomous vehicles, how do we know it's going to be safe? That the algorithms, if there is an accident, what caused it? Can we have transparency into that so it can create the accountability behind it? And then finally, unacceptable risk. These are not allowed. There are things like government social scoring. Anytime you're using the government's ability to use algorithmic data to score based on what people can receive in terms of medical care or social benefits. Biometric identification in real time, meaning that if I can identify you, there is a high risk potentially of misidentifying you. And that is just an unacceptable risk. So in real time basis, without the ability to go and check and be accountable, transparent, the fairness of that is the risk of that is just unacceptable. So there are certain things, and then they define this in great detail about what that looks like. Now, what's interesting is that this is all again just been approved, and there are regulatory statutes in place with penalties that could amount to between 2 and 6% of your annual revenues, of a company's annual revenues. And this is starting in the second half of 2024, so a year from now. And initially, it's going to apply to just companies operating within the EU, eventually to companies over a certain size operating in the EU, and then to all companies operating in the European Union. So they're phasing this over time. There's a lot of discussion about whether this is good or it's bad. The way I look at it is it's reality. It's not going to go away. And if you are doing any business in the European Union, you need to be paying attention to this and understanding what this all means. A really important thing alongside this is the development around copyright infringement. Similar to China, you have to disclose if you're using any copyrighted materials in your development of your systems. And it also pertains to the use of data of your customers and consumers that you may be collecting. Do you have the right to use that in training your artificial intelligence algorithms? A good example of this, you may be collecting information about your customers. For example, you may be having fitness data from an Oura Ring, a Fitbit, from an Apple Watch in your application. Can you use that in the development of your algorithms? Well, you have to be very clear in the user agreements that you have that you're collecting that data and that you're using it for these purposes. And so that's where the transparency becomes very important, because later on, if you do not have those rights, you may be required to take them out of your algorithm. And that is extremely difficult to unteach, to unlearn from a specific set of data. This also applies to the ability for consumers to say, I don't want my data to be used in that, so take it out. So being able to pull that information out, identify where it is inside your algorithm and take it out can be extremely difficult. So these are some of the key questions and issues coming up around this. All right, so I'm going to take a break here and see what comments we have. All right, lots of comments here. Let me just try to go through these. Let's see, we have Bob Pulver coming in, and his comment here is, I'm focused in the HR talent space, most in the US, as it relates to recruiting, hiring talent in a responsible, ethical, and transparent manner. Bob, welcome to the space. It is really difficult to manage because we've had these tools in our applicant tracking systems for a while to be able to read, source, and score the resumes based on the readings of that particular resume. So we've had that ability for a long time, but we haven't always been transparent that we're doing this. A lot of people have figured out this is how you actually gain your resume for various systems. But I think, again, there's going to be a higher need for that level of transparency about when you're using artificial intelligence. And these tools are becoming extremely powerful, especially in the use of the HR space. So I think we need to be very careful about that. Let's see, we have Michelle coming in from the UK, practicing IP and technology lawyer. Michelle, you should be talking on this live stream. So I would love to have you chime in with any ideas that you have. This LinkedIn user says, I would describe the current state of AI governance as too many drivers without a license on unfinished infrastructure lacking road signs. I think that's such a great way to put it. We're going to talk about the US, and that's a pretty darn good description of the US. And this person says, maybe the AI Act is a step in the right direction. Again, coming from the European Union, where it's very standardized, it's a concerted effort across the entire region. They're showing us how to do this correctly. Again, they were the ones who put the GDPR, the privacy laws. And in fact, here in the US, we have some efforts in California that are happening. We have some efforts in Congress. We have all the different departments doing things. I'll show you just a couple examples of that. But I would agree with you that it is a complete total mess right here in the US. Let's see, we have the person coming from Chicago. What do you advise AI practitioners and consultants who are focused on applying AI for companies but are lacking the education, awareness, and financial incentive to give adequate attention to current, pending, and potential regulation? Great question. I'm going to answer that. I'll do a little bit right now. The important thing I think to figure out is how are you actually using data today? It is all about your data story. And so, as we talked about before, the EU and China are very focused on where do you get your data and what data are you using to train your algorithm. And so, this is less of an issue if you're using, for example, the publicly available platforms like ChatGPT, where you're querying an already trained AI, generative AI, to do certain tasks for you. This applies more to when you are starting to build your own AI engines, your own algorithms based on your own proprietary data inside your organization. If you're starting to do that, then you really need to pay attention to what rights you have, who has access, what can you do with that data, and be crystal clear about what you can and cannot do. There's a famous case study from Weight Watchers where they were gathering data from children who were in those programs and using that to build models, again, to help people to build their artificial intelligence models to drive their applications in the programs. And some people sued and said, you don't have rights to do that. So they literally had to shut that program down, take all that data from those people and start from scratch. So this is a really important thing to think about, is what rights do you have with your data? And that's probably the most important thing right now, because we know that's going to be a requirement across any area, that you have an understanding, that you can be accountable for how you're using your data, where you're getting it from, what rights you have, and also be very, very diligent about how that data is being used to build your algorithms. And every company I know of is using AI today. At any size, significant size of company is using AI, even if it's built into their enterprise data systems. And so be really clear in your user agreements and legal agreements that you have those rights. So that's the most important thing I can think of that you should be able to do. All right, let's see. We have Bettina. Lots of comments here. I'm going to get through as many of these as possible. Let's see. US-based data governance leader trying to navigate putting best practices and policies in place. How can and should we govern that data once it's generated? That's a great point. Again, to the other side of this, once you generate the data, and I'll talk about this in the US and what it's doing. I really like what the White House Bill of Rights is doing. Are you giving people notice that this data is being generated by AI, that AI is being used? Is there transparency in this activity? I think this is extremely important because it's really understanding not just how the data is being created, but also how it's being used and the transparency in the user experience. But when AI is involved, and also if you can opt out of it. So let me get into that first of all, into this AI Bill of Rights. So this is coming from the White House. It was put out, I believe, at the end of last year. And a couple of the things that it puts out, I'll just go through this very, very quickly. These are the Bill of Rights, the Consumer Bill of Rights when it comes to AI. And first of all, it's safe and effective, that it's deployed to protect you from inappropriate or irrelevant data, that the algorithm has protections against discrimination, that you're doing your best to extract any sort of biases out of the data and also out of the algorithms, that that strong data privacy practices are in place, so that you have agency, you have control as a consumer over how your data is being used, which we just talked a lot about. Notice and explanations to Bettina's question. Once you generate the data, you want to know that an automated system, some sort of AI is being used. And this last part is really interesting. You should be able to opt out of a system. and have an alternative to this, being able to talk to a human. I don't know about you, but how many times have you been stuck in the chatbot and there's just no option to be able to send an email, talk to somebody? It's extremely frustrating. And so, from a user experience, being able to opt out of any sort of artificial intelligence algorithm and to be able to default back to a person. In your call center, it's like, I want to get out of this routing and talk to a person, hit 0 to talk to an operator. Really important aspect of this. So I think a really important thing here is to think about how we build trust with consumers, with clients, with customers when you use these algorithms. And those three principles, again, of accountability, transparency, and fairness are extremely important to have. Let me go on and finish the slides here. The last one is coming from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And I focus on these two entities because I think they have the most clear approach right now to thinking about AI guidance. It's not quite regulation. And an NTIA actually says there are four things that you should be doing as an organization. That is to map out the context and understand the risks that are being involved, to measure when those risks are, to analyze and track them, and then to manage those risks, and then to make sure you have this culture of risk management, of governance around all of that risk. So this is a really high level, again, way of thinking about mapping, measuring, managing, and then governing all of those things from a unified center inside of your organization. Again, this is guidance. This isn't necessarily the ability for the government at this point to say, oh, you're not abiding by certain activities. It's not regulatory, in that there are going to be certain consequences if you don't follow these guidelines. And the reason why this is so important to understand is right now in the US, the US traditionally has been very, very pro-business in its approach to regulation, especially around technology. And it does not want to dampen the ability for organizations to go as fast as possible, to be as competitive as possible in its development of these new technologies. And so this is the reality of our regulatory situation right now. We have three entities: China, Europe, and the US, different levels of regulation. And over time, there are going to be regulatory statutes in place, especially with the EU, that's going to require that businesses conform to certain levels of acceptable behavior. Now, you may have seen some of the news recently that these 8 companies went to Congress and met at the White House and said, agree to certain levels of behavior. Again, it was just a verbal agreement. We promise, we say that we're going to do things in an ethical way, in a responsible way. But again, competitive issues come on board. And one area in particular to watch is copyright and intellectual property. There's no doubt that engines like ChatGPT from OpenAI have been trained on intellectual property that they do not have necessarily the rights to be able to use those to train an AI. And it's being used now to generate AI, that content that is, again, potentially infringing on people's rights. It's especially an issue for images, for audio. You see the writer strikes, the actor strikes in Hollywood addressing this very, very core issue. As a content creator myself, it's pretty easy to go out there and just get summaries of my work through these engines. And there's no protection. I see no value from that, even though people are benefiting from the content that I created. So that's one of those tricky areas where intellectual property law and copyright law hasn't caught up. But I think this is the one area that you're going to see a lot happening, especially in the US and across all of these regions. All right, a couple other comments here, and then I know we're running out of time. Jillian asks, joining from the Benin Republic, are there AI regulations in Africa? I haven't seen any, but I'll take a quick look and get back to you in the comments, Jillian, to just again take a look. Again, I'm aware of these 3 power areas and centers of, frankly, power and commerce. And in many ways, that's where regulation is going to matter, because it's one thing to have it regulated within states in the United States or in countries, but it's the places that are going to impact commerce, businesses, that, for example, like the entire EU bloc, that are going to have consequences, significant consequences in the ways that those areas develop. Um, let's see. One of the things that Bettina says is a good challenge is that tools are so easy to access. That's such a good point. But there are little restrictions and controls on how they are being used. And so tracking generative AI-driven data is hard, if not impossible. Policy and training are first lines of defense that have to be put in place. And we will talk about this next week when I talk about AI strategy, because I so agree with you, Bettina. Right now, the reason why I am so focused on this is because it is walking in our back door. It is a highly democratized technology. And as organizations, as leaders, we have a responsibility, again, to make sure that it's being used in a ethical and responsible way inside of organizations, in a way that respects our existing laws around intellectual property and copyrights, and also creates this level of trust, a high level of trust with our customers and our consumers. All right, last question from Jay. Could game theory and bias balancing be applied by AI within AI self-regulating systems? Absolutely. Again, one of the interesting things about AI is that you have the generative aspect of it, and then you have the discriminatory aspect of it, and then the other part of it that's managing the feedback loops across both of those areas. So these three components are using things like game theory and bias balancing and lots of other technologies to make sure that bias, discrimination, all those things are being identified and addressed inside the organization. The thing that I'm particularly worried about is when you have open source AI platforms like what Meta is putting out there. Incredibly helpful, but those open source data platforms can be used to be trained against data that may not have those requirements. So the ability for people to put out publicly facing engines that have bias built into them becomes an issue. So identifying who those people are, imagine how biased our media is, how bifurcated it is across many different types of voices. I do believe we're going to see the same thing happening with AI engines and these generative AI engines, so that if you want to go to the right wing or the left wing or the bomb making AI, you'll be able to find it. Again, this is just a matter of time. Let's see, one last comment from Michelle. Dennis Hassabes has said that his approach to regulation would be using the scientific method, which is an honorable aim, but that's just one person to see it. Move fast and break self-creators. How do we find that balance between the EU's strict governance approach and the US's business favoring practices? There seems to be quite a gulf. You said it. There is a big gulf between the two. My personal response to this is that when it comes to the regulatory issues, the regulation is going to do what it's going to do. You as a business leader, you as a business organization need to determine how accountable, how transparent, how fair you are going to be in your business practices. Because the regulatory issues are something you have to be aware of, but my belief is that as an organization, you should be rising to a higher level of standards that abide by your values and are supportive of your strategy. But more importantly, what kind of relationship, what kind of trust do you want to develop? And I would hope that leaders would be going to a higher level in a way, because I do believe that higher level of accountability will lead to better business practices and overall higher levels of trust and agreement with your customers and your consumers. So one last question here. On a side topic, do you think head of AI and ML, like a chief digital officer, is needed at a certain level of maturity, and then the organization outgrows it, or would it be valuable and needed over a decade plus? So I'm going to talk about this next week a little bit, and I'll just put up here now just what I'm planning on talking about next week. I will be talking about generative AI strategy, and one of those areas is a touch very lightly on how to organize for this. Depending on what your AI strategy is, if it's going to be pretty light, you're going to use it in a couple of use cases, you may not need somebody in a permanent position. But if you believe that generative AI in particular is going to be highly transformative in your organization, then that person needs to be sitting way up high in the organization, probably all the way up in the C-suite, because they need to have this wide-ranging perspective and input from the other top leaders in the organization, probably reporting straight to the CEO, because the transformational impact of what AI could do for the organization is so tremendous that you need to have that strategic viewpoint, that broad viewpoint from across the organization. So we'll talk more about this next week. I'm fascinated by how we can think about the AI strategy. I talked about this a little bit when I talked about the AI stack last week, but it's taking this stepwise approach to creating a generative AI strategy. So I hope you'll join me next week in thinking about that. So that's what I have for today. I'm a little bit over, and I apologize for that. But please join me next week for a really interesting discussion, and keep asking questions in the comments. I do read everything, and I'll do my best to answer your questions to the extent that I can inside the comments. So again, thank you so much for joining today, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.